Scientology. If Omnism accepts all religions as essentially being valid, does it also accept Scientology? Well, that's a very good question. I've gotten it a few times myself, and of course I see it popping up on a lot of message boards where Omnism comes up. And frankly, it is a good question. First of all, I think it would help to understand a bit about how Omnism approaches a religion. A lot of people tend to look at religions as being entities in and of themselves, and of course they are, but as to whether or not they're positive or negative, I think often it's not really a valid question, and I'll explain why. To me, religions and all belief systems are really kind of Rorschach tests. They wind up telling you much more about the individual than they do about the religion itself. In other words, you can take a set of beliefs, and when you bring your own personality to it and who you are to it, it really winds up telling you a lot more about you than, say, Christianity, for instance. See, you could read the Bible, and indeed all the extra writings that might be included in one denomination or another, and take it in a completely different way. Christianity can be incredibly warlike, and it can be incredibly peaceful. If you were to look at Christianity in the time of the Crusades, where they were frankly killing quite a few people, you might look at Christianity as being very negative. But then if you were to look at Mother Teresa, for instance, you might think, well, Christianity is a very positive religion. But in reality, it's not necessarily positive or negative. If you read the Bible from top to bottom, you would find things all the way through it that could say a great many different things. Some of them even contradict. And depending on what kind of a person you are, you wind up grabbing onto the things within those holy scriptures that you relate to. And if you ever wonder why people will say, well, why is it that people take this from the Bible and they don't take this from the Bible? Well, that's why. We take what we relate to. We take what we agree with. And this is why sometimes it does annoy me when people of any religion will say, well, this is because this is what God said. This is what God said. This is what God said. This is what the Bible said, yada, yada, yada. Well, it's not what God said necessarily, or what the Bible said necessarily. It is what from that Holy Scripture you decided to relate to. It's interesting, this whole thing about gay marriage and homosexuality, which is a big deal in America right now, where people are saying, well, the Bible says there shouldn't be homosexuality. You know, because it's an abomination to God or whatever. And I will do a whole video on that later. But for the moment, suffice it to say that there are a few things in the Bible which seem to have something against homosexuality. They are not necessarily, it depends on how you read them, it depends on how you look at them, but I'll get into them quite a bit more. But it's interesting that a lot of Christians can accept something like, say, divorce, which is spoken of frequently in the Bible, considerably more frequently than homosexuality is even remotely brought up. Even Jesus making statements about divorce. And yet in our culture, we have come, say, since the 50s, to start accepting divorce as being a necessary part of our culture, and we just don't necessarily get into that part of the Bible as much. And everything in the Bible is like that. The Jews, for the most part, are considered a pretty peaceful people. If you think of these wonderful little rabbis down in their nooks exploring the law. On the other hand, they were slaughtering Canaanites back in biblical days and were considerably warlike. Some people might say today, well, what about the Israelites in Israel? They are obviously extremely warlike in what's going on between them and Palestine. But on the other hand, you also might just as easily argue that the government in Israel is very, very secular and doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the religion itself, but more to do with the massive cultural biases that exist in that part of the world right now. Whatever the case, religions aren't necessarily anything in and of themselves. They are simply what we bring to them, be it Hindu or Muslim or Christian. But what about Scientology? Back to Scientology. Scientology comes under a lot of fire, number one, because it's very modern. And it is a 20th century religion, significantly more modern than a lot of the world religions. And people tend to take more modern religions as being less valid. I think part of the reason for that is because we're able to look at older religions, and because we're nowhere near them, they just sort of take on a certain air of sacredness, sacredity. How would you put that? But modern religions were much closer to those people that began their religions, like L. Ron Hubbard, who certainly appears to have been a very flawed person in a lot of ways. And of course, a lot of people look at Scientology and they say, well, what about its practices? A lot of people will talk about the fact that if someone says something bad about Scientology, a lot of people will sue them within the church, and so many people will sue them that it will bankrupt them. These sort of horrible stories you hear going around, that if you're in Scientology, all they do is just charge you for everything. You have to be incredibly wealthy to be a Scientologist, because they charge you for every little thing that they do, and at large amounts of money. But I did a lot of research on Scientology. Of course, it's one of many religions that I did study. And when you look at the religion itself, when you look at its core values and its core teachings, oddly enough, for the most part, it's extremely positive. For one thing, Scientology is largely a giant detox program. You get into Scientology and they will immediately start getting you off all drugs and all alcohol, and they'll start giving you tons of vitamins. They'll start purging all of that stuff out of you. It's very important in Scientology that you not have all that awful stuff in you. Now, they'll charge you like $2,000 for it, which is essentially like a giant detox spa treatment, and people will often criticize it for being very extreme. Like they'll keep you in a sauna for 3 or 4 hours a day, getting all those toxins out of your body, and some people pass out, and there have been some accidents. On the other hand, you might just as easily say that most detox programs are pretty rigorous. So, you know, take that or leave it. Their teachings are really pretty interesting. You will take an enormous amount of courses, a whole bunch of different courses that they offer. Of course, you pay for each of these courses, but they teach you how to be a more positive person, how to relate to people. If you have problems with self-image, they're very good on giving you a stronger self-identity. And the auditing program, which of course may be the most well-known part of Scientology, is when you go in and essentially an auditor tries to get to the very bottom of what's wrong with you. They ask you questions, and you talk about the most horrible things that you've done in your life. In many ways, it can kind of be looked at like in Catholicism when you go to your priest for confession. It's kind of like a confession. All of those things are actually very positive, and really a lot of the negative things that people ascribe to Scientology have far more to do with the organization of Scientology than to the teachings of Scientology. There's actually a lot of very positive things to what they say. And the problem, perhaps, is that when compared to, say, Christianity, where you can take a very, very wide gauge of Christianity. You can look at Christians from this country or this country, all over the place. There's thousands and thousands of Christians, and you can say, okay, from this person, Christianity seems somewhat negative, but from this person, it seems very positive. Scientology is a very small group. They only have maybe 30,000 members, so they tend to be tremendously more similar than the cross sections you might get from, say, Islam, where you have incredibly peaceful Muslims, and then you have ISIS, who's on the other end of the scale. And even there, that's another great example. You go into the the Quran, there's very few texts about being violent to people, believe it or not. Everybody keeps, getting upset about these texts that are so violent, and there's very few of them. But if you're the type of person that wants to be violent to someone, it's not hard to get into that part of the Quran and say, okay, that's what I believe. I believe in those texts which seem hateful, and completely ignore and there's a lot of texts in the Quran that are very much about living with your neighbors in peace and being nice to people and being nice to other religions, and they're completely against the sort of thing that we see in ISIS. But it all depends on what kind of a personality you are. And I'm sure the same thing goes for Scientology as well. I'm sure that, when you hear people like Tom Cruise and John Travolta talk about Scientology, or at least I've heard Tom Cruise talk about it some, and he talks about how much it changed his life and how much the courses that he went through changed his life. And that's probably true. You could take Scientology, you could take the teachings of Scientology, and let's say 100, 200 years from now, someone makes an offshoot branch and they use all of those teachings, but perhaps in a somewhat more positive way, and people might look at those Scientologists as being very different than the Scientologists that most of us think of and run into today. And again, I'm not making a judgment call on Scientologists themselves, merely on how they're viewed by most people. So, in answer to the ultimate question, is Scientology a valid religion? I would say yes. It is valid with other religions. If you look at their core teachings, what they're talking about, they are very positive. I think this is a very interesting way to look at religions too, is because people, when they get into religions, how do I put this? People have the wrong idea, I think, on many occasions about religions they don't like. They think that people come to those religions and those religions teach a bunch of horrible, terrible things, and people just kind of go with it. And of course they don't. Most religions, even the cults, which you might think of as being brainwashing their members, even they come to the system of beliefs because there's so many positive things they do say in them. People don't tend to glom on to religious beliefs, or religious systems, should I say, that are negative. But the people who are higher up in those systems obviously can do whatever they want with them. Once they rope you in, once they bring you into a system with all these positive things, there can wind up being a lot of negative things there as well. But for me personally, I am looking at religions and systems of belief of all kind merely as what they teach. What do they teach? I can bring a negative thing or a positive thing out of this, and I'm sure, like I said, people could take Scientology and it could be negative or positive, just like Christianity, just like Islam, just like all other systems of belief. So, yes, Scientology is in many ways at its base a very positive belief system, but what people do with it, well, it's another matter altogether. I'm the Urban Omnist. I'll see you guys on the next one.